Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, resident PhD student.
And I'm Cameron Lalana, unemployed.
This is a podcast not necessarily about Tolstoy. Why do we name it that? Alliteration. This is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to explore different areas of Russian lit that we've, read in class or that we've wanted to read for a while. Today we're talking about The Nose by Gogol, probably one of my favorite and most ridiculous stories I've ever read in my entire life.
We will refrain from covering Gogol's life, although we may do that at some point in the future. This was written in 1836 in Imperial Russia. So as a general overview, if you are not familiar with Russian history, this is prior to the Russian Revolution, during the time of the Tsars. I do not know exactly who was ruling in 1836, but Tsarist Russia was a very stratified society, officially so, and that's going to be a fairly big feature of the characters in The Nose when we get into it.
It's Nicholas I, by the way, I looked it up.
You should have just led with Nicholas I and really impressed everyone with your just on-command knowledge of czars in different eras.
No, I won't take that. I haven't earned it.
How do you earn it?
Probably by finishing my PhD on time, but well.
Okay, well, at that point, you get the right to lie about where you learned something.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to. Also looking forward to not really having to be right and people just thinking I might be.
Well, then you just delve into some obscure literature until you find your point.
Well, that's what we're doing here today, so.
Exactly.
That's the fun. First impressions, what'd you think? How did it make you feel? We haven't talked about any of this prior to the podcast, so.
We have not.
I'm genuinely curious, because I know you're not a 19th century kind of guy. Not that I necessarily am either, but,
No, I am very much not a 19th century guy. I have, in the past, rejected reading a lot of literature from this era because I cannot stand reading it. This is a great piece of surrealist short fiction. I really enjoyed it. I had a fun time, even outside of analyzing it for deeper connotations. It's just fun. It's like reading Kafka, but not as soul-crushingly depressing.
Yeah.
I don't know. How did you come away from it?
For me, it is, and I don't know that this is necessarily the case. I thought it was, in world literature, probably one of the first instances of magical realism, or at least a precursor to magical realism. I don't know a ton about the genre, so I don't know if I can definitively say this is it. But it is an intensely realistic story about a man who loses his nose. So it has just the real aspects of Russian society in 1836, but it's just about a guy who loses his nose, which is just like the most absurd thing. in
a genre full of writing about Petersburg, either as the greatest city that Russia has or as just a trash pit, Gogol found the third way, and the third way is completely absurd.
Do you want to give a short synopsis about what happened? What is The Nose?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go in a little bit, then I'll probably throw this to you in a little bit, since I'm sure it'd be better than just talking this all the way through. The story opens up with Ivan Yakovlevich, who is a barber who lives on Voznesensky Avenue. His surname is unknown. Who one morning wakes up to discover that in his hot bread, the nose of one of his clients is located, and he recognizes the nose of his client quite immediately because he uses noses as to hold on to as he shaves them.
Now,
his wife,
you hate that, to find someone else's nose in your hot bread in the morning. I will say. So that's something that we can relate to, even probably as like a modern audience. Like, you're digging into your bread, the last thing you want to find is your client's nose.
Absolutely. I don't want anything to do with my clients, much less their noses at breakfast time.
Exactly.
Yeah, so his wife gets really angry at him, understandably. And this is some, if you find your husband Sweeney Todd, I wouldn't be pleased either.
No.
So she tells him to get rid of it. So he does, and while walking along the streets of Petersburg, he eventually finds his way to, I think it's St. Isaac's Bridge, and throws the nose into the River Neva before a police sergeant comes up to him. And then at this point, his story fades into the mist, and we join a much more important citizen, collegiate assessor Kovalyov. and I will let Matt take it from here.
Yeah. So collegiate assessor Kovalyov is the backbone of the story. He is the one who has lost his nose, and we kind of follow him through the rest of the story, trying to figure out what happens. And it starts kind of with a description about who he is, what his rank is. And for those who are unfamiliar with Imperial Russian ranks, they are the most important thing to everybody at this time. The higher your rank, the more important you are. And this was brought on by Peter the Great in his attempt to kind of reform Russia, to westernize Russia. And what's most important about it is that if you get to a high enough rank, you can become hereditary nobility, which is, that's pretty sweet. That's a pretty good deal for civil service. That is, you don't have to do military service. That was that's part of what's new.
Right. There was an equation between like all these ranks. There's like civil ranks, army ranks, navy ranks, court ranks, even clergy ranks, and they're all like on a 1 to 14 scale, more or less.
Yeah. But Kovalyov, he is the rank of collegiate assessor, but he makes it pretty clear that he does not want to be called collegiate assessor. He wants to be the military rank major, because I'm pretty sure he was in the military.
I don't know if he was in the military, but that's his equivalent rank.
Yeah, I don't know if it's actually clear whether or not he was.
Now that I read the passage where it mentions that he likes going by major, it does not clarify. So he might have.
Yeah, all it says is that he was a Caucasian collegiate assessor. It's really not important. Really, to me, it says a lot about his who he is as a person.
Yeah.
He's somebody who likes to charm people. He wants you to know that he's a major, and he thinks that that's an impressive rank. And it like kind of is. It's pretty good. It's not the best, as we'll see in the story, as he's kind of as he's going through the Petersburg streets trying to find his nose. So he covers himself up with a handkerchief, and he's walking around.
I will say, just to break in real quickly, going by major, I think, as a civil servant in his status, is the moral equivalent to those people who are married to someone in the military and demand that you address them by their SO's rank.
Yeah, it could be. You know anybody who does that?
No,
do that?
But okay, I'll walk that one back. I don't know if anyone actually does that, but I've seen a lot of people making fun of the people that do that. So I'm hoping that at the source of that, there is a real person and not just like some sort of Baudrillardian self-replicating force that is where the meme has overtaken any semblance of reality.
Mm-hmm. No, we'll take it as fact, because that sounds relevant. So the first place he runs into his nose is where Kovalyov is. He's going to get pastries, right?
I think he's like he's walking around the city, hiding his nose from everyone.
Yeah.
And he ends up seeing him. I think he's just left a coffee house.
Got you. Yeah. But it's just like happenstance, you know?
Right.
And he sees his own nose, and he notices that the nose is wearing the uniform of somebody who I think is 3 ranks higher than him. He's a state councilor, which is a 5th rank, so that's pretty high. That is the rank at which you are granted hereditary nobility in the Russian Empire. So it prevents him from being able to interact with the nose throughout the story, basically, is kind of the gist of it. He runs into it at the coffee house. He runs into the nose at church. And the whole story just traces him trying to get people to believe that he has, in fact, lost his nose. I think the first passage I really want to focus on is probably the one at church, because that's really where they start to talk. Yeah, I don't know how you felt about that one. I thought it was pretty funny.
I think it's really instructive for both his character and the major themes of the story.
Yeah, I have a passage basically that sums it up as he's trying to hype himself up to go talk to his nose. So Kovalyov, he's thinking to himself. He says, "It's clear from everything, from his uniform, from his hat, that he's a state councilor. I'm damned if I know how to do it, how to talk to him." And this leads to him being just an absolute idiot trying to talk to him. And he goes through he basically just bumbles through a whole introduction. He lists everybody in society that he knows as an acquaintance, and the nose is like, what are you talking about? And he finally says, I mean, you're my own nose. And the nose looks at him, frowns, and he says, you're mistaken, sir. I'm myself. And the nose says back to him, I see, sir, from the buttons of your uniform that you were serving in a different department. And the nose just walks away from him. And Kovalyov is just absolutely just doesn't know what to do with himself in the church.
And he immediately tries to hit on the girl next to him after not knowing what to do until he remembers he does not have a nose.
Yeah.
And freaks out so much that he needs to leave.
Yeah. That goes to one of my favorite like themes of the story or potential readings of it, which maybe we can get to at the end.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting one to hold on to and come back to.
Right.
So after the church, he goes to, where does he go? He tries to see the police commissioner, and that doesn't work out for him. Police commissioner's not home. So he goes to the newspaper office, and that also doesn't work out for him. Because, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, as he tries to put in an advertisement for his own nose, which, as you've said, doesn't work out for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, the person that's taking his like advertisement thinks that he's talking about somebody that has robbed him of a sum of money, Mr. Nozov. So he basically just adds an OV and makes it a Russian name. It shows really a breakdown of communication between ranks of society, which the whole of it is, that's kind of the main point. And this is probably to me, the funniest part of it.
Yeah. Of course, I think followed by one of the funniest parts in the whole short story when Kovalyov reveals to this guy that he does not have a nose. He takes off his handkerchief, and the guy's like, that sucks. Do you want some snuff?
Yeah. Yeah. That made me actually laugh out loud when I read it the first time, probably. So obviously he doesn't do well at the newspaper office. He goes from the newspaper office. Where does he even?
So at this point, Major, as he prefers to go by, Kovalyov, gets home and thinks back on his nose and thinks how weird this is, and decides that Mrs. Potochin, who is the mother of a girl who he's flirting with but is refusing to marry, must have done this to him. And he believes, quote, to get her revenge, the staff officer's wife must have hired some witches to spirit it away, and this was the only way his nose could possibly have been cut off. No one had visited him in his flat. His barber, Ivan Yakovlevich, had shaved him only last Wednesday, and the rest of the day and the whole Thursday his nose had been intact. So, here, referring back to your earlier point about Russian, his obsession with the ranks in society, Mrs. Potochin isn't Mrs. Potochin, she's the staff officer's wife. And while he's thinking about this, he's interrupted by the police sergeant from the beginning of the story, who comes in to return his nose. Who, although the nose was about to flee to Riga in a stagecoach, the police sergeant fortunately had his spectacles, and although he initially mistook the nose for a gentleman, came to realize that it was only a nose, and took hold of it and brought it back to Kovalyov. And Kovalyov's overjoyed. He pays the guy a bribe, in Old Russian, a nos, which might be related to a point about the story as a whole. Pays the sergeant a bribe to leave, I guess, and is just happy. And that's the point at which he calls the doctor to reattach his nose. At which point, Matt?
Yeah, the doctor says, I can't put that nose back on your face. And that's basically, it's a page and a half of the Major trying to convince the doctor to do it. The doctor saying, no, it'll only make it worse. But maybe put it in a bottle of vinegar. Maybe that would help preserve your nose. And the Major really doesn't like that. And I can understand why. I wouldn't like that answer either, probably.
Well, the doctor also suggests that the Major sells him, the doctor, his nose, and I also would not like my doctor offering to buy my nose.
Yeah, that's true. You don't. Yeah, that's. Yeah, I wouldn't want that too much either. I don't think.
into the doctor's office and he started like feeling my hands and was like, "This is a good hand. How much do you want for it?" I'd be very, very concerned.
Yeah, but how much would you say?
I don't know. If it was my left hand, like probably at least $30.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right hand, definitely important. At least 500.
500. Wow,
Yeah.
that's a big jump.
I know it could cover almost half of my rent, so that would be really cool.
Pretty nice, almost half. Yeah, for half your hands. Yeah.
Seems like a fair trade.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah.
But he doesn't sell his nose. Fortunately or unfortunately, it would have been a little funny. He instead writes a letter to Mrs. Potochin saying, "How could you do this? How could you have my nose cut off just because I didn't want to marry your daughter and flirted with her a lot?" And she writes back and says, "What are you talking about? If you mean by that I wish to put your nose out of joint, that is, to give you a formal refusal, no. That's no. She wanted him to marry her daughter all along. So we can safely rule her out. Not enough incentive or means to slice off this man's entire nose, I don't think."
A guilty person could never write that letter, as Kovalyov reasons.
Sure. Also, that's ridiculous. Yeah. So at this point, I guess everybody in Petersburg has figured out that he has lost his nose, and there is basically the rest of part 2 is people kind of going around various parts of St. Petersburg trying to see the nose, which is probably what I would do too. That would be absolutely ridiculous.
I mean, we lived in St. Petersburg, and if we had heard that today, we would have taken time out of our very busy days of doing really important things to go look for that.
Probably.
Okay, I think we're both thinking about what we were doing that day, and depending,
yeah. So you want to go through part 3? That's the last part. It's pretty short.
So while the world is out there looking for the nose, some are indignant as to how these stories could gain such currency in their enlightened century. With enough time, Kovalyov one day wakes up, and on the 7th of April, he happens to glance at the nose at the mirror and realize his nose is back. And after much exclaiming and calling in his serf to make sure that he still has it, he's got his nose back. It's just on, it's reappeared, and he goes immediately to get a shave from Ivan Yakovlevich, with whom we started the story. Ivan Yakovlevich is also shocked that the nose is back, and he gives Kovalyov the perhaps gentlest shave of his life.
Doesn't even grab him by the nose.
As he normally would. And at that point, Kovalyov becomes as he was before, and he, quote, "as though absolutely nothing had happened, his nose stayed in the middle of his face and showed no signs of wandering off. After that, he was in perpetual high spirits, always smiling, chasing all the pretty girls, and, on one occasion, even stopping at a small shop in the Gostiny Dvor to buy a ribbon for some medal. No one knows why, as he did not belong to any order of knighthood." And at that point, the very end of the story, you have the author, potentially Dostoevsky, but maybe just the vague author of the story, writing to you, the reader, about the strangeness of the story and whether or not it actually could have happened.
The author who?
I'm not certain. At the very end, it's directed at you, the reader, and it's like, I don't know if this could have happened or not. I don't know if it's supposed to be Gogol or merely just a vague.
So you said Dostoevsky, and I was like, wait a
I was
minute.
gonna say, sorry, I meant to Gogol. You can see the wine getting to me.
Yeah. No, this is my second time reading the nose, and I never actually thought about how long he had been without his nose. It's about 2 weeks. You kind of lose the sense of it throughout the narrative. I kind of thought, like, right. This is a couple of days, maybe. This is not that bad, but 2 weeks without a nose, that's pretty significant.
That's pretty important.
Yeah. So that's the nose. That's that's the long summary of it.
That is what happened. But what does it mean?
What does it mean?
What
Cameron,
does it
what do you
mean?
think it means?
What?
do you think it
Okay.
means?
So this is the part where I was reading this and like looking desperately for themes.
Yep.
Because I'm about to go up against a PhD candidate in literature to talk about themes. In short, we can talk about like in longer form later. I mostly kept reading this as basically Gogol making fun of a appearance-obsessed Petersburg, especially revolving around the idea of rank in society and the way. And I kind of read losing nose as almost a metaphor for losing face, and how much that, despite Kovalyov's rank, affects his standing in day-to-day life, and that he is reduced to going to Kazan Cathedral, arguing with his own nose that he knows, X and Y person in society, and that's why his nose should be back on his face. And like, I guess kind of addressing the thinness of like how much this rank actually means when you take away some basic things.
Yeah.
How did you read it?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's basically the gist of it. That's probably the majority reading. The main takeaway is, and not even just the differences in ranks, but also just the complete breakdown of communication between people who are not the same ranks. And Major Kovalyov is interesting because he totally brings us on himself in different ways. I can't remember exactly where in the story, but I remember he says that in the theater, I think he was saying that he thinks that jokes and attacks about people that are lower ranks than him are pretty funny, but anything at his rank or above, the government probably shouldn't allow that. They should censor it. So he is a victim of the system that he's absolutely trying to uphold throughout the entire story.
Right.
And so it's funny trying to see him kind of reconcile with that, because it doesn't go well for him.
Yeah.
At all.
Which I think if you're going with that reading, you could relate it back to that in Kazan Cathedral, which you bookmarked earlier, or put a flag in earlier, when he is finished talking to his nose, he sees a young woman who he tries to hit on in church, and then remembers that he doesn't have a nose, and that's the only thing that holds him back from trying to like just to start to womanize in the middle of an actual. In the middle of one of the biggest cathedrals in Petersburg, which is an achievement because there are a lot of big cathedrals in Petersburg.
Yes. So I think that brings me to like the secondary reading that it's not maybe secondary in terms of adherence to it, but it's a reading that we learned about when I was taking a Russian literature class, that having read it again, there's definitely more hints at it. You probably saw this like looking around, but the idea of Major Kovalyov having a castration complex,
right?
Like the nose is a metaphor for his penis, and that's one of the major problems for him because he is somebody who likes to hit on women, and he can't flirt with that other lady's daughter. He can't hit on the woman in church. Even being called Major doesn't even really matter too much to him anymore because he. There was that part where they were explaining why he likes to say major, and it was because he wants women to think that he, was in the military, that he's not just a civil servant, that he's he's masculine. And it fundamentally takes away a large portion, probably the only real characteristic that he's assigned throughout the story.
Right. There's nothing more specific about this character than that he's a collegiate assessor. That is his life, his rank is everything. I think at some point, I don't remember exactly what page this was on in my copy, but it says that Major Kovalyov was not averse to marriage as long as his bride happened to be worth 200,000 rubles.
Yeah. That's 200,000 rubles, and that's fine. Yeah, that's who he is.
Yeah. So I can definitely see that. I saw in other readings of it, equating his nose to both his penis and also toxic masculinity, which I thought toxic masculinity, the nose being a metaphor for that, is an interesting reading. But given that Gogol wrote this in 1836, I do not think that was on his mind.
Probably not in the way we understand it today.
No, not really. Yeah. Exactly.
But it does. Yeah. It does cut to who he is as a man and his position in society.
Right.
which is, I think that's a really interesting reading. I think there is enough evidence to say that is a legitimate reading of it.
Oh, absolutely.
I think Gogol was really, really clever, and that's really what he was known for in like literature, society, is for his satires and for just being a funny guy. And it really comes through in this. This is probably, I don't know. I've read a lot of stuff by Gogol, but this is probably one of the ones that's just like, it's short, it's compact, it's funny all the way through.
Yeah, I've not read as much Gogol, I assume, but of Gogol's pieces I have read, this is definitely compelling in the sense that it's really funny the whole way through.
Mm-hmm.
As compared to a little, you find a lot of condemnation implicitly in his other work, which is here, but it's very funny.
Yeah, I think he's able to go through just like a lot of parts of Russian society really quickly. It's not just he's talking to other people of high rank. Like, I mean, he's going through, the newspaper office. He's, writing letters. He's going through a lot of different characters that Gogol is able to really kind of characterize very, very quickly in the page and a half, maybe, or 2 pages that's dedicated to each of them.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, the people, it's not really that in depth. It's largely a caricature of them, but it's fun.
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
fun.
you get to see for each of them, with Ivan Yakovlevich, you get to see his his home life of the moment something weird like finding a nose in his bread happens, which his wife immediately begins to accuse him of like assaulting his customers. And
Oh yeah, that's where it starts. It starts with the
Yeah.
barber. His wife is ready to turn him into the police within like the first page. This guy
Yeah.
he can't even have coffee and bread for breakfast. His wife makes him choose one of the two. So yeah, you get immediate. It's funny from the very beginning.
Yeah. It also has one of my favorite lines from the whole piece, which is Ivan Yakovlevich, like any honest Russian working man, was a terrible drunkard.
Yep.
And although he spent all day shaving other people's beards, he never touched his own. I just love those 2 sentences. It's one of my favorite parts. But every time you meet someone, they become, I guess, representative of something bigger. The police officer won't go away until Kovalyov bribes him.
Yeah.
The clerk at the newspaper is afraid of libel, so he will not publish Kovalyov's advertisement because he's afraid that the censors are going to get angry at them and think it's a metaphor for something else. Even like, I don't know, the doctor. I mean, maybe the doctor you could read as the only principled character of the whole thing, who refuses to do something that he could do but thinks it's bad for Kovalyov. Still trying to buy his nose, which not as weird, not as outright funny as the rest, but still.
See, I don't know. I don't think the doctor really principled. I don't know. I think he is lazy. And because the doctor, he lies to him. He says, I could put on your nose, but trust me, it would be worse. I don't know what he means by that, but I don't know how he was planning to reattach this man's nose, and I don't know that I have that much faith in him.
That's fair. I mean, I think the level of which medical professions were valued at this time far exceeded their ability to actually do things, but that didn't really stop a lot of them. I think if he were to do it, it would be horrifying. It would be a really bad time.
Yeah, I think the extent of his medical expertise is probably to dip something in vinegar.
This is Russia, so it's rubbing vodka on it.
It could be, yeah. I mean, they're in Petersburg, so maybe it's a little bit better, but certainly I don't know that they're at nose surgery yet.
Yes, yeah.
Something else that I have heard and have found, it's not necessarily a reading of it, but it's more of a genre or narrative topic. And it's something that I hate when writers do now, but it's a little different reading something that was written so long ago. To see something similar employed would be interesting, I think.
Right.
Which is, I said at the beginning that this could be an example of an early work of magical realism, and it is very realist all the way through, but there is a case that could be made that none of it actually happened, that it was all a dream. Every single part, it fades into this fog.
Right.
And Gogol could have just not written that, but that's included for a reason, and it's worth kind of looking into because doesn't need it. Narratives move on their own, whether you say that a fog descended or everything's shrouded in fog, and we don't know what happens next. It feels like the narrative is kind of moved in that way.
Right.
I don't know if you thought about that or noticed that. That was something that I have just heard before.
I hadn't thought about that previously, but if I wanted to connect it to what my reading, or at least what I took away from it, like at the end of the story, nothing changes, right? Kovalyov learns absolutely nothing. Not entirely dissimilar to how in a dream you walk away, you wake up, and your life is exactly the same as it was before, regardless of any lesson you might have learned in that dream.
Yeah, that's absolutely part of it. I feel like for something so traumatic and out of the ordinary, you would think that the main character, is going to learn some sort of lesson. I'm going to be a better person. I'm going to do whatever. I don't know. And the Major learns none of that.
Yeah.
It's completely unchanged, like you said.
And in fact, he meets Mrs. Potochin and her daughter, who he has been flirting with for some period of time, and he talks to them for a while, then like huffs his snuff and says, "That'll teach you both, you old hens. I'm not going to marry your daughter, simply par amour, as they say, if you don't mind," and then walks off.
Yeah.
And he's like maybe a bigger dick now that he's got his nose back.
Yeah, he absolutely is. I think that's the only thing that made him an interesting character throughout it, is that he didn't have his nose. So if he had it the whole time, it probably wouldn't have been that interesting of a story. You really wouldn't have been. I mean, I was like rooting for him to at least like find it. I was like, all right, how much does this guy have to endure before he can just get his nose back and stop running into it at bakeries dressed up in the 5th rank as nobility? But then at the end, you're like, God, he's just kind of sucks.
Which maybe it leads into either the idea of it's a dream relating to the lack of impact it has on his life as a whole, or just, even if you take away the rank of these people who are so obsessed with it, it doesn't change anything about them. I did have a question for you. How do you read the very end? In the last page, you do have the author of this piece address you directly.
Oh, yeah.
How do you read that? How do you come away from that?
I don't know. To me, this is very characteristic of Gogol. If you read like Dead Souls, which is probably his main work, what he's known for, or his longer work that he's known for, I guess. He does this a lot. This is a very Gogol sort of thing, to just break and kind of address the reader in a way that's pretty funny. I don't know how I think it fits his genre. It fits his style of writing. It's just stylistically, it's a very Gogol thing to do. I don't know that you see that in a lot of writing at this time. Like I said, I'm not a 19th century specialist, so I don't know that I can say that. But definitely from my own experience and what I've read, that Gogol is definitely the funniest writer at the time. Yeah. And this is definitely something that is characteristic of his work. And it's present at the end of it. I don't know. What do you think of it?
I didn't know initially what to think of it. I mean, like you said, it's deeply funny. He in the halfway through the paragraph at the end, he starts asking questions like, how did the nose disappear, and how did it turn up in Yvonne's bread? And then he's like, I don't understand it, not at all. But the strangest, most incredible thing is that authors should just write about such things. Thus, that, I confess, is beyond my comprehension. And he ends it on I think this is one of my favorite story endings I've ever read. However, when all is said and done, one can concede this point or the other, and perhaps you can even find... Well, then you won't find much that isn't on the absurd side, will you? And first of all, it's really cheeky and very funny. Yeah. After some thought, I kind of read it as almost, I don't know, not a note to the censors, but a note which is to the reader in such a way that it can make a point that gets past the censors. Like in the original version of the story, something if you do not know at this time, censors were in Russia very prevalent for anything that was printed.
Yeah, everything that was printed was read first.
Yeah. So in earlier versions, some places in the story, Kazan Cathedral and one other, I think it's a coffee shop or another type of shop, they had to be censored because the censors are not down with that, so that had to be changed to like a general market or arcade. I kind of read that as him, just a general statement that the society which I am writing about is a bit absurd. nothing you'll find isn't on the absurd side. But since he's ostensibly writing about the story, it's not something that the censors would necessarily jump on.
No, that's a good point. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. He really, I think, like I said, magical realism really does describe a lot of what this is, because he's able to see the absurd and the grotesque really in very ordinary events.
Right.
The craziness of the story is the fact that he is talking to his own nose. But what's so ridiculous is that he can't even talk to his own nose because of the rank difference. And yeah, so I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's interesting you brought up the censors, because this is what I thought when I read Gogol at first too. I was like, Gogol is radical. He really wants to go against the grain and look at society from a different point of view. Right. And what I did not realize was that Gogol really actually was fairly conservative in his political leanings, and even in his later works, he became like people didn't like him after he wrote some of his essays. Like, he was really in favor of the monarchy and the Orthodox Church and of a lot of things that people wanted to reform or just outright get rid of. And so I thought it was interesting that not only this work, but he has a lot of other works that people thought were just like really radical, but he himself did not read them that way or didn't necessarily intend them to be read that way. I just thought it was an interesting little point.
Right. I mean, that might be a more interesting point about Russia as a whole, that at that time, even relatively conservative thinkers were kind of like pushing back upon maybe the censors upon them specifically in such a way that they might have just been thinking, oh, this is a little bit silly. But other people who were significantly more against the system read as much more radical than was actually intended.
Yeah, he really was. He really did support the system in general. I think he just did. I mean, obviously he saw aspects of it that were wrong and did want to see some level of reform, but he wasn't like, let's tear it all down, start over again kind of radical.
Right. I was talking to my friend a while ago, and I was like conveying to him this old Russian meme about like how different authors see Petersburg, and like Gogol, it's like this big, like it looks like Mordor, and Pushkin sees this flowery paradise, and Dostoevsky sees a trash can. And I think it's interesting that if we were to like, a lot of Russian authors write about Russia in a way that is like almost like they are kind of disgusted by their society, in a way that they're like still really nationalistic, but are like very critical of it, in a way that if you were to read that in, I think, American literature, almost always you'd see someone writing that from like the fringes of society, of like, I don't know, some like far right-wing literature about tearing society down and all these things that disgust them. But this is not that far out of the mainstream in Russian literature in various periods.
No, it really wasn't. I mean, he was praised by literary critics in Russia for a lot of his works, kind of until the end when he came out as being more conservative and having those views more explicitly in his writings. I mean, I'm pretty sure they were like essays, so it was like, here's what I think. It's a different point of view. It's still incredibly culturally relevant, especially his views on Petersburg and his relation to other writers. I mean, Gogol was one of the biggest influences in Russian literature going forward from this period, especially on Dostoevsky. And you mentioned Kafka earlier, who also cited Gogol as one of his major influences. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think I don't have anything more to say about that. I think it was a great place to kind of wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you enjoyed the episode, well, first of all, that makes us happy, but also grad school doesn't pay very well, and neither does unemployment. So if you happen to have a few dollars to spare, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy. It'll help us buy the books we'll be reading in the future.
Yeah, thank you for listening to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated. I'm Matt Gerasimovich.
I'm Cameron Lalana, and Matt, before we go, I've got one last question for you.
Yes.
1 to Yeltsin, how drunk are you?
I'm really only a 2 right now, I gotta say.
Oof. All right, you got to catch up. I'm at easily a Gorbachev.
Birthmark and all.
Yeah, I've been drawing it on as we're talking.
Good.
Okay, well, you'll hear from us again next week.